This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Welcome to episode 48 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, and this episode is the grateful anniversary episode because it marks 1 year since the Thoughtful Travel Podcast launched. In some ways that seems like a really fast year, in some ways quite long. It's funny how time works like that. But anyway, I have been publishing the Thoughtful Travel Podcast for a whole year now, and I'm so grateful for so many parts of it, and that's why this is the grateful anniversary episode. Later on I'm going to talk to a few people who I'm particularly grateful to have been able to chat to. I'll explain that more in a second. But first of all, I want to say a few reasons why I am so grateful for having had already one amazing year with the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. So for a start, I am super grateful to Brooke and Jackrabbit FM, because when I had the idea that I could join the Jackrabbit FM network, it was the only way, I think, that I would finally get my podcast idea off the ground. I've loved listening to podcasts for years and always wanted to have my own, but the technical challenges and the just having to learn all this new stuff when I'm already constantly learning new stuff, it just seemed a little bit too much for me. And when Brooke was keen to add a travel podcast to her Jackrabbit FM network, I was over the moon. So thank you, Brooke, and to everyone who works with you and helps keep my podcast coming out every week. I'm eternally grateful, especially because when I said to you, I'd like to have this special format and have 2 or 3 different guests every week and all these bits in between. And that's a lot more complicated than the typical podcast, which is just an interview with one person or just a couple of hosts chatting. But she was all for it. So I'm really grateful. Thank you, Brooke. Now, the other reason that I have thoroughly enjoyed working on the Thoughtful Travel Podcast this year is that I have been able to use it as a fabulous reason / excuse to chat to old friends. So over nearly 13 years of travel blogging, I have made all kinds of very interesting and wonderful travel friends around the world, both bloggers and otherwise. And being able to say to them, hey, let's catch up on Skype and chat for an hour or so, and we can use some of that on the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It has been such a pleasure, and it's quite different to talk to someone on Skype than just to sort of stay in touch on Facebook. Already I'm grateful for things like Facebook for staying in touch with people I've met on my travels, but to have this reason to actually properly speak in real time, it has been fabulous fun. And a big shout out to all of those lovely friends, too many to name, but you know who you are, and I'm so glad that I got to chat to you in the last year, and I'll hopefully chat to more of you in the coming years. Now, it's not just the people I talk to, but the people who listen as well. And I'm still a bit surprised that real people listen to my podcast. I'm very grateful for that. And I love getting feedback. So I'm very grateful for the reviews that I've read on iTunes. Pretty much every one of them gives me goosebumps. It always seems like the people who listen to the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, they like it for the same reasons that I created it. And that's exactly the reaction I hope to get. And especially a big shout out and a huge thank you to the members of my Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, which only began a couple of months back. But it is such a fabulous way for me to talk to my listeners and to have some really interesting conversations. I'm always so pleased by how much interesting chat happens in there. So thank you. And now my final big grateful thing is what's going to lead on to our guest today. So it's been great to chat to old friends, but a really huge bonus, which I hadn't exactly anticipated, to be honest, is being able to make new friends, people that I have only got to know because of this podcast that I probably wouldn't have come across in other ways. And so my 3 guests today are people I've spoken to over the past year, and they're all people that I'm fairly sure I probably never would have met online otherwise, or I never would have really come across them and had the chance to chat. And so I'm particularly grateful to get to know them better and to be able to use them in my very grateful anniversary episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Now, my first guest today is actually Hayden Lee, who hasn't been on the podcast yet. It's his first appearance today. Now, Hayden is of the Travel Stories podcast, and it is, well, I have to say, my favourite other travel podcast because it's such a great format. He talks with really interesting people and has an interview with them, but then he gets them to tell a story, like a really interesting travel story, something that's happened to them, and it gets put to music, like original music, which fits the story. Hayden interviewed me a few weeks ago, and I think next month my episode will be out, and I can't wait to hear it. It's a really fabulous podcast, and I do encourage you to listen to it. I think if you like the Thoughtful Travel podcast, you will probably very much like Hayden's Travel Stories podcast as well. Anyway, we got chatting about all kinds of things. You'll hear more from Hayden in the coming months. But this particular chat is about that age-old idea of making a choice at a fork in the road. And this particular road was in Vietnam.
Well, I think it's very easy to go to the places that you would usually find, obviously. I think that there are places where people frequent them. And I think going off the beaten track, taking the other fork in the road, is oftentimes an incredibly good idea. And one thing that comes up for me is I was traveling in Vietnam. I was riding a motorcycle from the very south to the very north. And I came to a literal fork in the road. It was right or left, right? And so I'd just come out of a place called Nha Trang, which I still don't know how to pronounce. And that place was a place that you would usually find. The place I was staying was opposite the YOLO hostel, and there was a fish and chip shop. Like it was exactly. Yeah, not my type of thing. So I left from there and I came to this fork in the road. Now I could either go right, and that was to Highway 1, Highway 2. That's the route everyone takes when they do the Vietnam trip. That was on the Top Gear episode. They take the highway, and you kind of know what you're going to get. You know, you're going to get the highway. You're going to get at a lot more places like Nha Trang, and you got the beach and everything like this. And yeah, it's cool. But left, I didn't know what was left. I mean, I had a big old map with me and I could just see nothing. The roads kind of stopped. I'm like, are there even roads there? Who knows? Let's find out. And taking this left turn really changed everything on that trip. The bits that I can remember from that trip so vividly all happened after that left-hand turn. I went into places where I had to decide, can my bike go through this road? And questions like this. Yeah, it was absolutely ridiculous. And I remember this one time in that trip, it was, a few hours down that road. It was right in the middle of the mountains. I was on a road that was not a road. It could barely fit my bike down it the widthways. It was ridiculous. It was like a public footpath, I was like, goodness. Is this the road? And,
I love it.
Yeah. And but the weirdest thing happened, right? Now, I've told people and they do not believe me, but I swear it happened, right?
Tell me.
So I was going down this, I guess you'd call it a road, this path, I suppose. And it was in the middle of nowhere. But there was a bit of a fence on each side of the path. And in Vietnam, how it kind of works is the more rural you are and it's weird because it also works with like the poorer you are and the more third world, I suppose, to put it in other words, for want of a better word, you are, the kind of darker skinned you are. It's weird to talk about, but like it's true. The people in the city, especially when they use products and stuff, tend to be lighter, and the people in rural areas tend to be darker, and their English level goes way down. Things like that, right? So it's a different type of Vietnamese person in a way. It's not someone you'd meet in Saigon, Hanoi, anything like that, right? So
it makes sense. Yeah.
So with this in mind, as I was coming down, I stopped because I was like, can I get through this puddle, or can I get round this rock or something like that? And I looked forward, and maybe 20 or 30 feet in front of me, walking up to this, walking up to this fence on the side of the path, coming towards the path, was this bloke, all right? And he was very, very dark, right? I was in the middle of nowhere, and he had long, matted hair. And this is the part where people stop believing me. But he was wearing some sort, I swear this is true, some sort of animal skin, right? This is
No
totally
way.
true. And it gets worse. And he was legitimately carrying a spear. This genuinely happened. I
Can see why
cannot
people
tell
don't
you.
believe you.
Tell me about it, right? Imagine how annoying it is telling this story and having people go, yeah, right. Yeah, good one. So, and he was walking towards, to cross this path to carry on his way, right? And he climbs over the fence. It was only a little fence. He climbed over the fence. And as he was just dismounting this fence, I'm just there. I'm just stood still like, what will happen now? I do not know. And he looked at me. We locked eyes for maybe a second at the most, whilst he was still walking across this path. And then he just looked away and carried on. He looked at me like I was a tree, or like it was the weirdest experience. It was so strange because
Wow.
in Saigon or Hanoi or somewhere like that, or even if you go a little outside of Saigon, a little outside of Hanoi, where you get a bit rural, people stare at you. If you're a white guy there,
Yeah.
like, and you're quite obviously not from there, then they're like, what is that? But this
Yeah,
guy
you're different.
who,
And here you're very,
yeah,
very different. And yet.
exactly.
Oh
And he
my
didn't
gosh.
seem to care. I was like, is this the end? Is this it? Am I going to get speared?
Yeah.
But but no, nothing. And he just crossed the road and went on his merry way. And
Wow.
it was ridiculous. And I put it down. I put all of this down to taking that left-hand turn.
Mm-hmm.
If I hadn't have taken that turn, I would have arrived in Hoi An or wherever and gone, yeah, this is cool. Let's go to a restaurant. You know what I mean?
Instead of having these unbelievable stories to tell instead. Yeah.
That no one believes. So,
Yes, literally unbelievable. Yeah. Yes.
exactly, right?
Oh, no.
So yeah, I think it's really
That's
beneficial
fabulous.
to, go places you wouldn't normally find and try and say yes to the experiences that come up, because that's when you do go to the places you wouldn't normally find. And I find that if you do, you just expand your horizons on what you're able to see, what you're able to witness, what you're able to experience.
Absolutely. And you have an experience that's quite different to what the average traveller sees and what the average thing you read or hear about. And I'm sure that's a very valuable thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if for me, the number one thing with travel, the number one destination is freedom. That's the number one reason that I do it, to try and attain that feeling of freedom. And it was at this, in fact, weirdly, it was at this point with the right and the left turn where I realized this feeling of freedom. It was the feeling of, I only own 5 kilograms of belongings. So I had everything on my bike and it was just me and this machine just there. And that was everything in my world was there in this little me and this machine. And I could go right or left. And the feeling that overcame me was it didn't matter at all. I could go right, I could go left. I'm not trying to get anywhere. I've got nothing to get somewhere for. I've got no time limit. And this feeling of freedom is what I live for with travel. But what I was saying was that the second feeling is expanding your horizons, expanding your experiences, expanding your life. And I think when you go to places that you wouldn't normally find, it just increases this expansion, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that kind of expansion carries on into all aspects of your life, because you can feel, okay, here I made this, some would say crazy decision to go, not the normal route, and look, it turned out great and it was fascinating. And I think you can take that back to all kinds of aspects of life and apply that to say, okay, you don't have to do the same thing that everyone else does. And look, it will still turn out great and possibly even better.
Oh, absolutely. I think many things in travel are metaphors for many things in life. It's something we say on our show all the time. I always find myself saying, yeah, it's true in life as it is to travel. I say that all the time, right?
Yeah.
Because so many things are metaphors, and this is the same. Going places you wouldn't normally find brings you a wealth of experience that you wouldn't have found anyway if you go the normal path. And it's the same in life. If you go a different way in life to what 90% of people do, you will find more opportunities that the rest of the people just don't come across. And the thing there is being able to say yes to these opportunities, saying yes to these opportunities and making it work, because that's where life is.
Hayden has lots of wise things to say, but I think that old concept of taking the road less travelled by does often prove to be a more enlightening path. But perhaps more than that, taking any road and not just sitting at home is probably the real trick to getting the most out of life. So my next guest today is Matt Treglia of the Words With Winos podcast. So I met Matt purely because his podcast, Words With Winos, was sitting next to mine in iTunes for a while. I don't know if I would have come across him otherwise, so that's fabulous. Likewise, actually, the lovely people of the Life Bohemian podcast, who I've interviewed quite a few times as well. So thank you, iTunes, for putting fabulous people next to me so that I could meet them. Anyway, Matt and his girlfriend Marilyn decided after they finished college to travel long term, and I was really curious to find out how they'd reached that quite momentous decision.
The American way of life is basically like you go to school, you get a job, and then you work until you retire. And you have to pick like a major, like what you want to do forever when you're 18 or 19 years old. And I mean, I was a kid. I don't know what I want to do with my life at that age. And I just did it because, I don't know, it sounded cool. So halfway through college, I actually went to this job interview. It was for an internship interview. And I realized like they were asking me all these questions. And I realized that, like in my mind, in the middle of the interview, I was like, oh my God, this is not what I want to do with my life. I don't want to do broadcasting. Why am I here? So in the middle of the interview, I was spacing out in the interview, so I knew I wasn't going to get the job. I wasn't doing a very good job, and I didn't get the job.
Fair enough.
And I was just kind of sitting in my room one day, just thinking like, what should I do? And I think like I just started watching travel shows just for fun, not really in an interest in like no serious interest in traveling, just watching it because it was cool to watch. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh my God, like, this is awesome. I want to be like this. I want to see the world. And like in that moment, I just did research. I was just reading people's blogs. That was such a big deal to me. And reading like these short books on like how to begin traveling and how to just start and doing it. And for me, I kind of noticed to definitely start was to teach English because I didn't really have experience with anything else. And it was just a good way to get a job out of school, and you could just move to many countries in the world, particularly Asia. Mm. And I was like, oh my God, this is it. Like, this is what I want to do. I don't know if I want to teach forever. I don't know if I'm a teacher, but this is a good way to start. And I had that mindset. I kind of told my family. I didn't tell anyone else. I told my family. And they were just like, yeah, whatever, Matt. I mean, you do whatever you want, kind of thinking it was just another phase or whatever. Yeah, and then actually I met Marilyn like after this, like a few months after this. Yeah, so she didn't really, I never really talked about my interest in traveling with her because it was kind of just my thing. I kind of kept it to myself. And we started dating, and she was applying to jobs for after school. And in my mind, I'm like, no, like, I don't want to do that. Yeah. But I didn't tell her because I really liked her. I didn't want to like ruin our relationship.
Yep.
Yeah, but at the same time, I didn't want to get some kind of job I knew I would hate. So like she was applying and I was kind of applying. I was just like, I was doing it to make her happy, but I didn't really have an interest in it. And then I remember one day she told me that like a few months after we graduated, she told me that she had this dream where she was just backpacking around Europe. And Ooh. I knew in that moment, I was like, all right, this is my chance to convince her to travel the world. And I did. I told her about Thailand and teaching English, and we never looked back. That's what we've been doing for almost 3 years now.
What a fabulous story. I love it.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
I think it's a really brave move to think that way. And it's not that different in Australia, but I think from what I can imagine in America, it's even more expected that you graduate and you get your good job and you keep working. And like you guys have often only 2 weeks vacation per year. We have more than that, but yeah, so there's this really real expectation of this is how your life will be, and to break that mold can be pretty tricky, but you've obviously managed to get past that, so well done.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was difficult at first. Now it's just my family definitely is okay with what I'm doing. My friends are still a little like, "What the hell are you doing?"
Yeah.
But but yeah, it's definitely gotten much easier, and it's
Yeah,
it's
and I think
great.
once you've proven that it's possible, then a lot of people's arguments against it just disappear. So
Yes.
you can say, look, I have had this work and I've been here for a year and 2 years, and yeah, so how can they argue against it? They can't say it's
Yeah.
impossible. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's funny how life works out, and I wonder how Matt and Marilyn's path would have looked if she hadn't had that dream about taking off and seeing the world. I wonder how you would have broken it to her, and if they would have agreed to take off and travel long term. They've certainly been doing a good job of it so far. So I think it was the right choice. I don't think it was the right choice. I'm sure it was the right choice. Anyway, my final guest today is Kiliii Yüyan. Now, in fact, my chat with Kiliii happened a year ago already. Goodness me, how time flies. But he was someone I met again purely because of my podcast. In fact, a friend had heard him interviewed on a photography podcast and said to me, "Oh, I know you're starting this travel podcast. This guy travels and does really amazing things. I think you'd probably be, interested to chat to him." So I looked him up, contacted him, and I did. And he's still one of my very favourite guests. Yeah, I just love talking to him. Now, our chat today is about some of his experiences doing Stone Age travel and covering it as a photographer.
I've been out covering it's a special project by a group of people that are living Stone Age out in the eastern Washington, and you guys out in Australia probably haven't been paying too much attention to wildfires in the United States, but
not massive, but go on.
yeah, Washington State has been having its biggest wildfires of all time, and while I was out there on one of these trips, so a Stone Age trip basically means you go out there with only stuff that you've made from the land in a Stone Age fashion, which means no metal,
Oh, wow.
no plastic, nothing like that. And when I went out on this, the only thing I was allowed to take with me was from the modern world as my camera
Fair enough.
to document the trip. So I had to join in the same capacity as everyone else. And we were out there living, hunting and gathering, and it was I have to say it's a little bit scary being out there because we were there in this beautiful valley, this sort of idyllic valley in the subalpine, that there were three wildfires encroaching from three different sides.
That sounds scary.
And so, yeah, about twice a day we'd hike up to the top of a ridge and note the direction of the wildfires and the wind, and to kind of get a good look at, because they're not very far away. The closest one was only about 6 kilometers away.
Wow.
And, that can move in a hurry.
Yeah, I know. We have plenty of them here. They go so fast at times, yeah.
But, the group had lots of conversations about it, and there was a lot of decisions to make, including whether or not to go out there in the first place, because we knew that the fires were encroaching and it was going to be difficult. But, we made choices based on looking at the weather and understanding the weather, like, the locals who have lived there for a long time, looking at all those. And, there's a certain amount of preparation that you do, but at a certain point, you just kind of have to toss a coin and have faith in each other.
Right.
And in your own judgment, and say, okay, I am going to go sailing today. Or, I'm going to make that crossing I was going to do, or I am going to do this trip. Because the thing is, the most of the things that are out there that are really valuable that you can do, you really can't know. You cannot anticipate, and it can't always be safe.
Oh, that's so true.
And as a result of going out there, being out there on the ridge, I was able to shoot photographs that really have this beautiful post-apocalyptic look to them, because we're surrounded by smoke from these wildfires.
Wow.
And it looked like the end of the world, because the sun would come up. It'd be 11 a.m. and the sun would look like a big red orb.
Wow.
And there was just smoke blowing everywhere and ash blowing everywhere. And it's just incredible place to be. And so we were always ready. We always had a backup plan to leave as fast as possible out the last direction, which had no fires. And there were lakes that were nearby that we could always get into and work our way out. So, there are all these sort of backup plans. And it was something that seems really scary at first, slowly becomes more and more something that you can tackle.
Wow.
But I think, just going up there to the top of the ridge and looking out over that was such a wonderful, beautiful, different experience, because it took something that was really very scary, because we had walked over the areas of places that had just recently burned, and you could see the carcasses of animals that hadn't made it out there. that had died and burned. And so, I was just picturing myself
being one of them. God.
Right, my friends in there. But you get up on top of that ridge, and I was looking at the fire, and it was very beautiful and absolutely worth taking the risk and sort of tackling that. But with as much preparation as possible.
And with a sensible degree of caution as well. Yeah, it sounds like.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And I think often maybe not to that extreme, but lots of parts of travel are tackling things that are scary. Are usually most of the best parts. So I think staying home is rarely the better option.
I agree. Yeah. I agree. That's right.
Cool.
As long as you're not scarred permanently, it's all for the best.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, I think I don't do crazy. I've never been walking near wildfires, but I do, sometimes have real anxiety before I leave for a particular place or for some reason. But I never decide not to go, and I've never regretted going anywhere, no matter what happened. That was always a way better experience than staying home. I think, as Kiliii points out, risk is everywhere and in all kinds of travel, but as long as you have sensible preparations, then there's no reason to stay home pretty much any time. Although I have to say that some of the trips Kilii's done, and this one he described in Washington State as well, I actually don't think I would have done those ones. I think I would have been staying home, but my life is probably the poorer for it. Anyway, that is it for the very grateful anniversary episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast, episode 48. You can find the show notes for this episode at notaballerina.com/48. And as always, and especially today because it's the gratitude episode, I want to give a really, really huge thanks to my guests and let you know where you can find them. So first up, Hayden Lee. You can find him at the travelstoriespodcast.com website. And of course, you can search for Travel Stories Podcast in iTunes as well. And I thoroughly, thoroughly recommend it. After Hayden, I chatted with Matt Treglia, who's from Words With Winos. And you can find their website at wordswithwinos.com. And similarly, look up their podcast, Words With Winos, on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. They recently did a chat with the very famous travel blogger, Matt Kepnes. So worth a listen. And you got to love someone's, a couple who have a good glass of wine with their podcast. A bottle of wine, isn't it? I have to listen and find out. And last of all, Kiliii Yüyan. And you can find him on his website, kiliii.com. Kiliii is Kiliii. He has breathtakingly amazing photographs. So if you, especially of landscape and stuff, if you're interested in that, just definitely have a look. And similarly, he has a great Instagram account. So he's at Kiliii Yüyan on Instagram. So KiliiYuyan. Look him up and be amazed. So I would love to see more of you in our Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group. It is a wonderful place for a good chat about all things travel and thoughtful. So just look for the Thoughtful Travellers group in Facebook, or there's a link in the show notes. You can get me on Twitter at Amanda Kendall, use the hashtag ThoughtfulTravelPod, and I very much look forward to chatting with you again soon. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.
Jackrabbit FM. For your ears.